Kate Grenville is one of our most significant writers, I think. It's actually 40 years, I think, since your first book came out. Bearded Ladies, short stories.
1984.
1984, yeah. And I learned this from your website, though, that you've been writing with a view to publication since you were 16. So by my calculations, you've published 18 books. That might be wrong because then I saw other lists, which was 17 and then 19. Yes. Anyway. And among them are the novels Lillian's Story, Joan Makes History, The Idea of Perfection, which won the Orange Prize, which is now known as the Women's Prize in Britain. The Secret River in 2005 was the winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. It was on the Booker shortlist. It was the winner of the New South Wales Premier's Award. One Life, her memoir of her mother's life, came out in 2015 and is very significant today because it probably led into the writing of Restless, Dolly, Maunder. In fact, your last novel, A Room Made of Leaves, which came out in 2020, was the Wham! Book of the Year that year, but that was the year of COVID. So we actually did a conversation over Zoom.
I remember that, yeah. It was lovely. I had my Ugg boots on and I was so comfortable. I miss COVID.
and so now after this is come Restless, Dolly, Maunder, which has been shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Prize and also for the Women's Prize, which was what the Orange Prize has now been renamed as. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kate Grenville.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Rob. Thanks.
So, Kate, I mentioned your memoir of your mother's life, One Life. Restless, Dolly, Maunder is based on your grandmother's life. In your writing, it's fair to say that your family has been a very fruitful source. It's the sort of gift that keeps giving, isn't it?
Oh, I could not have done it without those family stories. As I asked you just before we came on stage, what would I have written if I hadn't had that wealth of family stories? I'm blank. I mean, I would have written something, but I'm glad I wrote these ones. Look, I was terribly lucky because my mother was a kind of... She was a kind of historian manquée, really. She realised not just how important the past was, but specifically the parts of it that had not been recorded, which she was part of. You know, my family is, with really one exception, kind of rural working class people until my mother's generation. They are the people who leave very little trace on the world. They don't have time usually and often didn't have the education to write even letters or diaries or anything like that. And I think they, and perhaps the culture that they lived in, often didn't think they were worth writing about. I mean, that amazing book by Facey, A Fortunate Life, it kind of burst like an explosion on the world. Oh, wow, there's a whole lot of other people besides the gentry that have stories that we want to read about. So Mum had that passion for hanging on to those stories, passing them on to, I have to say, a very resistant young woman in the form of me. But luckily Mum lived to a grand age, and by the time she died I had woken up to myself and gathered all that I possibly could from her. So thanks, Mum.
Did she write all this down, or did she just tell you stories?
Look, she had written a lot of it in the years before I got interested. In desperation, she wrote it. And in fact, she was probably a writer manquée as well. Many of the little fragments start by her saying something like, I've always wanted to write a book, but I've never had the right pen. Now I've got the pen and I have to do it. And she would peter out after a couple of pages. And then a couple of weeks later, I could see that she had started again. I've always wanted to write a book. This time I'll start it from the end. So, like a lot of us, she was constantly looking for, well, first of all, ways to procrastinate, but also ways to actually do it. Starting at the beginning is very often not the best way to get started with a piece of writing. So she left a huge mass of these little fragmentary bits and pieces, and she also was very unself-conscious when I finally, when the penny dropped, I got the tape recorder out. She was totally at ease with that and talked into it, and I then transcribed those. So I've got a huge amount of stuff.
Yeah. Kate, it's fair to say, isn't it, that Restless, Dolly, Maunder would not have been written had you not written One Life, is it?
I think that's exactly right. One Life is the story of my mother's life, because her own memoirs, of course, they included the generations before her, but they were obviously much more detailed about her own life. She was quite a remarkable woman, although she would have resisted that word, I think. She was a woman of great dynamism, and the interesting thing about her, one of the interesting things, she was born in 1912, when women still were not generally trained for any kind of proper work. Her mother bullied her into training as a pharmacist. Now, my mother had wanted to be a teacher, probably of English. She loved poetry. But she did pharmacy because my grandmother was such a bully, and it was probably the best thing for her. So in some ways, she was extremely unusual. I've seen a photograph of the 100 or so students of pharmacy in 1929, I think it was. 100 men in suits, and I think it's 3 women down the front, looking a bit sort of squashed, I have to say. Anyway, but in other ways, my mother represented not just her own story, but a whole generation, that generation of women who were really the first to have those kinds of opportunities. So it was her mother who really shaped her life by forcing her to become a pharmacist. And that kind of got me thinking about Grandma. I did quite a bit of research for her in order to flesh out my mother's story. So I found out a few things about her. I had a few bits and pieces. I've got an old silver teapot and a funny old ragged velvet jacket. So
there's a good story about the velvet jacket, which we might come to later, yes.
I had those few physical bits, which are wonderful for a novelist. But I didn't think I was going to write about her even then, until 4.5 years ago, I myself became a grandmother. And at that point, I remembered something. Sorry, I'm going on. This is very
No.
It's
this is fine.
Background to all this. At that point, I remembered the one memory I had of my grandmother. She came to live with us when I was about 6. And I remember her as a very cranky, cold, unsmiling, stern. She was always kind of rousing on me for something, especially how messy my hair looked. Even then, that was the truth. Anyway, one day she came on me while I was in the garden, and I was scratching around in the dirt, and suddenly I'm aware of her standing beside me, this very tall, somehow dark, sort of emotionally dark person that I was rather scared of. And she looked down and she said, "Do you love me, Kathy?" Well, I was brought up to be a truthful child. So I looked up and I said, "No." I was only, 6 or so. And for years I've been telling that I've been telling it for laughs, and thank you for laughing. It is funny, but when I became a grandmother myself 4.5 years ago, I suddenly thought, what grandmother, in what planet does a grandmother first of all have to ask their grandchild if they love them? And also, what person does that come from? What kind of experience of life does that question come from? And that's where this book started. I thought, okay, I've got one image of my grandmother from my mother, but this other thing is like a tiny door that might open into an understanding of why my grandmother was the way she was.
It's interesting because she, reading One Life and reading Restless, Dolly, Maunder, she had a fractious relationship with your mother. She wanted to show love to her, but she just couldn't, could she? And that seemed to bug her all her life. Mm-hmm. And then your mother, when she was dying, the question she asked you is just so sad. She asked you, why didn't my mother love me? Mm-hmm. So you decided to write about her, but did you want a bit more freedom to write about her? And is that why you chose to write the book as a novel?
Look, I didn't only want the freedom, I had to have it. Because when I had been writing about my mother, well, first of all, I knew her extremely well from a lifetime of living with her. And also her memoirs didn't just talk about what had happened to her, but what she felt about them. They were very expressive at times. She talked about the feelings she'd had. Not always, but often. Whereas with my grandmother, Mum's account of her mother told me all the events that had happened to Dolly, all the things that had happened in her life, but not a skerrick about what she thought or felt about them. There was absolutely nothing personal in it. So I knew that if I was going to tell this story, I was going to have to just plunge in, boots and all, and in the best way I could, being as kind of plausible as I could and as true to the facts as I could be, I was going to have to make stuff up, which is where you have to start calling something a novel. And I held back from doing that. I mean, in a way, I had done that with my very first book, Lillian's Story, which is closely based on a real person. And since then, I've had a lot of thinking about the ethics of doing that. Is it really right to take a real person, and in this case, use their actual name, and make up an inner life for them? Well, I decided that actually, yes, I did it with misgivings, but if I didn't do it, then my grandmother would remain voiceless. And what's more, a whole generation of women, the generation she belonged to, born in 1880, into kind of, not into the gentry, the high class, that whole generation would remain voiceless. It was an opportunity to fill in that gap and to give a voice, and that was probably better than silence.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about her character, and her determination? In the book she describes herself, or you describe her as the hinge generation.
Yeah.
What was the hinge generation?
A woman born in 1880, as my mother was, every generation of women before that, apart from the very tiny elite, was born into a world where they were almost certainly not going to get any kind of education, probably not even be able to read and write. Absolutely zero agency over their lives. No power whatsoever. I mean, they weren't even allowed to own property until the Married Women's Property Act came in. I don't know when that was exactly, but sometime around then. So she was born into that world. Her mother had lived in that world where a woman, just because she was a woman, had kind of zero chance to do any of the things she might have wanted to do. Now, in 1880, things were just starting to shift. In 1880, the year she was born, a most incredible revolution happened, not just in Australia but all over the world around then, which was free, compulsory, secular public education. And that was a revolution that we don't even remember how massive it was, from a whole population being largely illiterate and having only the opportunities that you can have when you can't read and write. Suddenly, from one day to the next, that all changed. So when Dolly turned out to be clever, it meant that she had been to school. She had 14 years of learning at Currabubula Public School, a little tiny one-teacher school. At the end of that time, she said to her father, I want to train to be a teacher. I want to be a pupil teacher. And her father said, and this is verbatim from the family story, he slapped his hand on the kitchen table and he said, over my dead body, any daughter of mine goes out to work. Because, of course, it would shame him. It would look as if he couldn't afford to keep her. So that means Dolly's, her longing, her hope, her dream was just cut off like that. There was no appeal to that. And in those days, if you were a woman and you wanted to do something other than just be a wife and mother, you could be a teacher. Well, that was closed to her. You could be a nurse, but someone had told her about bedpans. She didn't want to be a nurse. And if you were Catholic, you could be a nun, but she wasn't a Catholic. So there was no other option than to get married, which she did.
Which she did, yes. And she wanted to marry one man, but he was a Catholic and she was nominally Protestant. So that was a no-no, wasn't it? Because he was terrified of damning his mortal soul.
Yes.
So she ended up marrying Bert Russell, who worked with her father, and who her mother was very keen on because he sliced the bacon the right way. I think you have a bit that you read after they got married. I think that is a nice...
Yes, I'll just read it to give you
gives an idea of what's going on.
Yes. So she was. She put off getting married. I mean, she did fall in love with the Catholic, and there was another boy who was a bit high class, so he was also out. So finally she married Bert, but very reluctantly. There is a photograph, which is in the book about my mother, of Dolly on her wedding day, and the look on her face is the look of someone who has... What would you say, Jason? You've seen the photo.
It looks like she's resigned to a fate that she doesn't want.
Yes.
It's a fairly stern look, as if to say, "Oh God." We were talking before about the picture, and I'm not sure if I misidentified. But her left eyebrow seems to be raised, as if to say to whoever's looking at the picture, "Look what I'm in for." You know, I'm not sure if that's accurate though, because she does have quite arched eyebrows. But
look, she does. But when you pointed that out, and I thought that's brilliant. It's a kind of Penny Wong. You know what Penny Wong does? Penny Wong look.
There's a lot to be said for a good raised eyebrow.
Isn't there? Yes, I wish I could do it. Yeah, so, yes, thank you for pointing that out. I've never noticed it, but I will never not notice it now. Yeah, so she postponed getting married, as is obvious from the wedding photo. So she was 29, I think she was 30, which in those days was like completely on the shelf, over the hill. Talk about elderly prima gravida. So she had to get married. And she'd known Bert well. Anyway, they went onto a farm near Gunnedah, which is in western New South Wales, and they were going to just become farmers for their lives. Gunnedah was 50 miles from Currabubula. Currabubula is where Dolly was born, and in every audience I've spoken to, there is at least one person with a connection to Currabubula. Is this the... there we go, there we go. Tiny little place, it's extraordinary. Gunnedah was 50 miles from Currabubula, out on the black soil plains to the northwest, and Rothsay was another 5 miles west of the town. The first morning there, she stood on the veranda, looking down over the paddocks, where the wheat was bending and shifting under a warm breeze. It was only the week before that they'd been married. She couldn't believe how a day's journey from Curra had brought her to what might as well have been a different continent. Out here, there were no enfolding hills as there were at home. This was a landscape of height and air and space. There was that vast bowl of sky above her and a sense of being able just about to see the curve of the earth as it turned through space. It gave you a weightless feeling that there was nothing to hold you down. You might float away. The house sat in the middle of the flatness, so from every window the eye could travel without obstacle all the way to the soft place where the horizon became the sky. Until now, as she looked out over the gleaming endless land with its moving skin of wheat, she'd never realised just how closed, how narrow, how hemmed in things were at Curra, that village squeezed into the kink in the range. When you were in Curra, there were just two ways to go, down the kink to the south or up the kink to the north, and every single thing was familiar and old and stale. Whereas out here, whichever way you looked, the endless space was like an invitation. The track to Gunnedah ran past the front door. She suddenly realised it would be a new beginning here. She wouldn't be Dolly Maunder, known to everyone since before she was born, everything about her already judged. She'd be Mrs. Bert Russell from out at Rothsay, a brand new person in the world who could make her own choices about who she was. Bert got up early every morning. She'd pretend to be asleep as he padded out to the kitchen in his socks. She'd hear him lighting the fire, filling up the kettle. He was a man of habit. She knew the next sound would be the rattle of the bread box and the little knocking from where he was cutting the bread on the warped board. The tea caddy open and shut, the cup tinkling on its saucer. She'd known him all her life, so there hadn't been too many surprises after they married. She knew the way he pursed his lips towards his glass of beer, the way he smoothed his thick moustache after every swallow of it, the way he put his muscled hand down beside the plate when he'd finished his dinner. What he liked to eat in the middle of the day? A cold chop and a hunk of strong cheese. What he liked after tea? Bread and jam. What he liked in bed? Well, it wasn't too bad. He knew to sweet-talk her first. "You're a pretty little thing, Dolly Russell," he'd whisper. And she didn't say, "How can you tell, Bert, it's dark?" The surprise was that the thing wasn't bad at all, not like some women made out. Dolly always had a project that fuelled her all day. Sometimes small things. She'd plant pansies in that old wagon wheel lying in the grass. She'd seen it done at Aunt Emma's at Bendemeer, and she'd never forgotten. Big things, going over to the new kinds of wheat they were bringing out that didn't get the rust. No matter what you were doing, there was always a better way to do it. Whereas Bert was inclined to accept whatever came along. "Oh, well, we could," he'd say when she told him about the wagon wheel or the new kind of wheat. It wasn't that he was lazy, though when she got cranky she accused him of that. The real reason was that he didn't like change. He plodded along, working hard, his horizon small, his ambitions modest, sticking to the familiar, not taking any risks. But she'd get an idea in her head and it wouldn't leave her. She'd keep at him and keep at him. "By God, Dolly," he said one day, resigned, but admiring as well, "you never give up, do you?" Could have been written on her gravestone. She never gave up.
She certainly didn't, did she? She drove him into different businesses, and she had this huge determination, and she had a huge determination that she would not be, she would have money, of her own money, which was very unusual at the time, wasn't it?
It was unusual because women had no means of getting money, basically. I think it wasn't the money that she wanted, except that money was a key to independence.
Yeah.
That's actually what she wanted. The British reviewers of this book, or one of them, said that Dolly was a woman trying to rise above her station. That's a very English way of looking at it, and not at all what she's about. She wanted what any of us in this room would want, a chance to be the person she was, not to be something else that had been imposed on her. And the money was the way to do it, particularly after Bert turned out to, well, have a roving eye. He was a bit of a charmer. I mean, he was well into his 80s when I met him, when I knew him, and he was still a bit of a charmer. So he had various lady friends. So a lot of Dolly's life was spent kind of dodging around that. One of the many reasons, I think, they kept moving. She was restless. I think her nature was restless, because I think I could see it in my mother, and actually I know I have it too. You do something and you don't want to have to just do the same thing again. There's got to be another, different, more interesting way of doing it.
Because early on in her marriage, is this a spoiler if we talk about...
Oh no, it's not a spoiler, I don't think.
No, okay. It's not the best way to start a marriage, is it? When you have a child and you go into a bar. Well, please tell us the story.
Oh yeah. Look, again, my mother told me this story. Because Dolly was so reluctant to get married, she and Bert had got engaged, but then Dolly went away for some months to Dorrigo. And when she came back, her mother was very keen for them to get married very, very quickly. And that was okay. Dolly went ahead and did it. But afterwards, when they'd been on this farm at Gunnedah for a year or two and they'd had their first child, a boy, she wandered into the barn one day and she found a locked tin trunk. It's such a cliche. And like Pandora, she just had to open it. Curiosity killed the cat. And in there she found papers that were for child support that Bert was paying to a young woman who had been employed in Dolly's household when she was... So while Dolly was away in Dorrigo, Bert had got up to no good with this young woman, had a child. The child and the mother had been sent away, but he was paying child relief. That was bad enough. It meant that Bert had kind of betrayed her in a very basic way. But the very worst of it was that her mother must have known about it. Her mother must have, in fact, organised for the child relief to be paid, for the mother and child to be sent away, and above all, for Dolly to get married quick sticks before somebody,
it's a terrible betrayal.
It's a terrible.
Terrible. And their relationship never healed, did it? They hardly saw each other. And she didn't, I'm right in thinking that she didn't go and see her when she delayed going to see her when she was dying in hospital until after she'd actually died.
Look, that's a little bit of novelistic speculation there.
Oh, that's good to know, actually.
Yes. Perhaps I should, print it in 2 different colours ink or something. This is real, this is not real. I thought a lot about how you would get on with your mother after that. And it didn't seem that they would have had the relationship, because I think people obviously often didn't talk very frankly to each other in those days. So it probably would have just stayed between them, this great big toxic elephant in the room. And so I thought, OK, well, when her mother died, what would that have been like? And I could imagine Dolly... Look, this is one of those plausible things. It may have been very different. I could imagine Dolly just putting it off and putting it off, not quite knowing how to deal with it. That's very plausible from my experience. And then finally going days before her mother died and not really being able to resolve it even then.
I'd like to ask you about writing it as a novel. It seems to me that, well, there are 2 questions I'd like to know. Firstly, I'd like to know about the research you had to do, the research other than from your mother's memoirs, but then the responsibilities that you felt and also the liberties that you took. Okay.
Well, I might start with the last bit, the liberties that I took, which I've kind of mentioned.
Yeah.
It is a liberty, but it's that or silence. I tried not to take any liberties that I felt were coming too much from me, if you know what I mean. I mean, obviously, the liberties came from my experience as a novelist. Stuff always really comes from their own world. But I wasn't pushing a barrow. I didn't want to make Dolly out to be anything in particular. She was obviously a complicated mixture of a whole lot of things, as we all are. So the liberties that I took were within a fairly narrow band, I think you could say. What was the middle question? I can remember.
The middle question was, well, the responsibilities, which you've sort of touched on to a degree.
I think it is a great privilege, actually, to be kind of allowed to write about somebody's life like that, and it is a responsibility. I neither wanted to make her an angel nor a devil because I thought both of those wouldn't be truthful. I felt that my responsibility was to say, first of all, the complexity, but also there is a bigger picture here. I'm telling this story because it has a bigger agenda. My agenda is not about her, it's about giving voice to those silenced women who were forcing open the door against a hinge. What I picture is, those doors that have got a bit of grit underneath them and they sort of scrape as you force them open. Because she changed my mother's life for the better. Jason, you mentioned that my mother on her deathbed said, why did my mother never love me? And I would love to just have just a moment back with Mum to say, actually, your mother did love you because she gave you the thing that she most wanted and that she knew would make the most difference to your life, that is financial independence, which Mum certainly needed. So, yeah, the responsibility is to tell a picture which is actually going to kind of make a larger difference. It's not just an afternoon's entertainment, I hope. I hope that it will say, this is what the world that we came from was like. And that has given shape to the world that we now live in, as men and women. So research, that was the easy part, so I left that to last. My mother's memoirs, overwhelmingly. Trove. Do any of you here not know what Trove is? Good. And I hope lots of you are doing family history. So I put Dolly Maunder into Trove, not thinking that she would have ever made the papers, but she did. Just once, a dance at the Currabubula Hall, so I knew what dress she was wearing. And the kind of snooty, patronising, slightly sarcastic kind of smart aleck journalist tone that the thing was written about gave me a whole scene where Dolly actually met this kind of smart aleck, city slicker journalist and, something happened there. Those objects that I have, the teapot not so much, but the purple velvet jacket, which I used to wear for a while, and it was lovely. It sort of swung in a very, very lovely way. My grandmother loved a good length of nice red velvet. And so looking at that object and thinking about what it means to care about clothes and to care about beautiful fabric, I'm not quite sure what that meant, but it was another dimension to her life. Sometimes you just have to put something down, not because it means any big thing in particular, but just because you know it's the truth.
The novel is a very expansive form, isn't it? This is, there's fiction, there's memoir, there's auto-fiction, I suppose. It allows you to do so much, doesn't it? And I just, it really seems to me that in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years here, the way the novel is written and the different forms it seems to take has changed hugely. I don't know if that's something that you've been aware of.
Look, I think all the old categories are falling apart, basically. I called my mother's story One Life, My Mother's Story, because it's not quite biography and it's certainly not a novel. So, what do you call it? And this one, I've called it a novel, but, a lot of it isn't a novel. If I had written it from scratch as a novel, I would have shaped it in a very different way and it would have, the proper story arc and all that business. I mean, this does have it, but... So I think all those old categories, like a lot of categories, they don't actually reflect reality. They're conveniences, and it makes life seem simpler to make it in little, neat little compartments. But in fact, I think it's very fluid, and perhaps that's what we realise. There was one other thing about research, the most important thing that I didn't say, which is going to the place where the story happened. So I stood on that veranda at Rothsay, which is still there, and it's still called Rothsay, and the nice people who live there invited me to lunch when I got in touch with them. So I stood on the veranda, and if I had not stood on that veranda, I would not have realised that feeling that she has in that moment. Oh, anything is possible in that landscape. So, and even little things, that breadboard with the warp in it that knocks, I've got one just like it. That's the one in the book.
So Dolly and Bert moved around a lot, pubs, hotels, guest houses. You went to the places. I know you said once to me that you went to the Bayview Hotel in Newtown, I think.
Oh yeah, Botany View.
Botany View Hotel. Yep. But the peak of their businesses was the Cumberland
Caledonian
Hotel in Tamworth, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, they bought and sold hotels for 10 years after the farm failed. They just had they had 7 years without a crop, apparently, hail and locusts and all the things that people here are probably familiar with. And then they went into business buying and selling pubs. And the trick was, when I went and did the research at the archives, that's another place I researched, I saw that they kept every pub, or the lease actually, they didn't own the freehold, for exactly a year and then passed it on. And I'm assuming that there was some, tax reason or capital gains reason why that was so. So that's why they had a huge number of hotels in those decades. And in each case, they made a fortune because Dolly turned out to be a fabulous business person. She just had a head for business, could see how you could turn a small struggling business into something fabulous so that a year later you could sell it for a lot more money. And Bert happened to be a fabulous guy behind the bar. I mean, for a start, he could hold his liquor. He drank, apparently, my mother said, a bottle of scotch a day.
Oh, heavens.
For something like 15 years. And, he was 98 or something when he died.
And he was good at chatting up customers and people,
exactly.
and women. And
yes. And men too, I think.
Yeah.
He would have had just that kind of bantering thing that goes on in pubs. He was a big, strong man. He'd been a shearer, so he could toss out anybody. So they made a great team. So the upshot of that was that they made a fortune, and in 1928 they put all the money they'd ever got, plus they borrowed a big chunk of money, to buy the biggest and poshest hotel in Tamworth, the Caledonian. Now 1928, of course, was not the best time to take on a huge mortgage, so the inevitable happened.
Yes.
But they did end up in the Caledonian in Tamworth. I don't know, any of you know Tamworth? Yes, okay. Well, you would know then that the Caledonian, tragically, is no longer there. I have seen photographs and it was a classic, luxurious, enormous, fabulous hotel. The top place in town, Mum used to say it cost 4 shillings to have lunch at the Caledonian when you got to get a good feed at the Greeks for 9p.
Yeah, I looked at the pictures. I looked at the few pictures that there are, and
right.
it looked absolutely wonderful.
Yes.
You can just, and you paint a beautiful picture of them there as a very, very prosperous then, prosperous
yes.
Caledonian, and getting in all the sort of the landowners from around, getting them into that for that 4 shilling meal and everything. And yes, then,
yes.
And so when the Depression hit, that was the only time that they went bankrupt, basically. Isn't it?
That's right. It was the only time they'd ever borrowed money, the only time they'd ever bought the freehold, and it was just a terrible... And they had got a bit cocky, probably. They thought they could do no wrong. So they lost everything within a year, I think, because a big hotel, nobody had the money to spend there. My grandmother wanted to turn it into a boarding house, and Mum always said that they could have weathered the Depression if they'd done that, but my grandfather said, over my dead body...
again?
Will you again? Would anybody turn this hotel into a doss house? So they went on they managed to scratch their way onto a little farm and weathered the Depression there. The other thing about the Caledonian was that in Dolly's youth and in Bert's youth, there had been a lot of posh, the squattocracy was alive and well up around Tamworth. People who used to have polo ponies and play polo, and they'd come into the Caledonian, and Mum didn't actually tell me this, but I could imagine my grandmother really delighting in the fact that these terribly posh women came in, and they didn't know that Dolly's father had worked for them. I haven't told this story very well, but Dolly's father had worked on Gunnaganoo, which is the posh place out there, and the person who ran it used to say, "Stand back, my man, at least 3 yards. You harbour the flies so." So there was this load of humiliation that these polo players kind of unknowingly carried towards Dolly and people like her. So that to have the posh hotel and to be the lady of the hotel would have been a wonderful revenge. So then go bankrupt, it was a heartbreak.
One of the things that jumped from you start this book with Nancy's first memory, And I thought it was interesting to compare. She's when she's very little, and has her head plunged into the horse trough water because she's been crying a lot. Her father takes her out there, and I was very interested in how you dealt with that in the novel. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yes. Look, in the novel, obviously, my mother, in the biography, in Mum's story, she has this memory of having her head dunked in the icy water at night of the horse trough outside, and her father, she said, carrying me like you'd carry a log of wood under his arm back into the house. So it's purely a story of, horror. But looking at it through Dolly's eyes, it was kind of a gift to me because of that terrible betrayal of the, the support papers and so on, the terrible betrayal that Bert had done. I think that might be why Dolly always felt ambivalent towards certainly her first two children. It was as if the whole notion of having a baby, which she'd been so delighted about, was kind of tainted when this other dreadful secret emerged. So when she found it very difficult to be a loving mother to the little children. I mean, we'd say now that she had trouble bonding with them. So when Bert picked up my mother and took her out to the horse trough, I've got Dolly thinking, I'm hesitating saying this because it's so awful to even think of. Just for a moment, Dolly thinks, hold her under, just keep her head under the water. And the minute she thinks it, it's gone. But that seemed to me plausible and kind of psychologically very truthful about somebody who has been hurt as badly as Dolly was hurt by what her mother and her husband had done.
It's a
horrifying
terrible
scene,
moment, isn't it? Yeah, it really is. But
I don't even want to think about it, actually.
No, but it is quite brilliant, I think, because because something came between Dolly and Frank and Nance, and yet later on, when Frank goes off, he joins up during the Second World War and is taken prisoner. She's absolutely distraught, isn't she, at his fate?
That's right. She had never properly bonded with him or with my mother, or that's how she felt. But when he's away, he was taken prisoner. He fought in Timor, was taken prisoner, as they all were, and sent off to the Burma-Thailand Railway. I mean, they didn't know that then, but they knew he was a prisoner. And then the regret, the remorse of not having loved him, or not having shown him the love at least, that kind of flooded in. I mean, my mother said she never recovered from Frank's death because of that. She felt slightly responsible for having urged him to go and fight. But more than that, she just felt I never had a chance to let him know how much I loved him. And I think that's, again, it's something that it happens, doesn't it? Once somebody's dead, it's too late. We shouldn't wait.
But you had, you give her the satisfaction of his last letter that comes to her eventually is, well, he says, give my love to Father, Nance and Max, his other brother. The letter is addressed to Dolly, isn't it?
That's right, yes. Yeah. And I imagined, it's actually not even a letter. The Japanese issued pre-printed cards in which you could just cross off the options, I am well or I am in hospital. You had to choose one of those. And at the end, you're allowed to say, my love to Father, Max and Nance. And I looked and looked. I've actually got 3 of those terrible little cards. And I thought, it's her name on the front. Dolly Russell, and Mrs. Bert Russell, as she was then. And she would have looked for any comfort that she could grasp in that awful situation. And that, I think, would have been, no matter how illusory, the card could have been addressed to his father. He addressed it to her.
And it's terrible. It's really a very, very sad part of the book, and also the letter, because she thinks that Frank is alive. When the war ends, she assumes Frank is alive, and she writes him a letter.
It's a heartbreaking letter,
which is then returned.
Yeah.
And you include the letter, and it's.
Yes, it's the only written document I have from Dolly, and it's the letter she wrote to Frank on the day that peace was declared. She had no idea that at that point he had already been dead for nearly 18 months. So she writes, "My dearest son, thank God you are free," or something like that. It goes on for a page of just an outpouring of joy and relief and love, and the bitterness to realise that it had been sent off into the void and to be returned to her. Probably better if they'd just kept it. So she had an awful lot, that generation suffered terrible things, and she suffered along with them.
I mean, the book fits into the sort of theme of your work over the years, doesn't it? About writing about forgotten women whose stories have not been told, going all the way back to Joan.
In fact, going all the way back to that book of short stories that you, which are kind of about women who kind of don't fit the conventional womanly thing. And The Secret River, which is probably my most famous book, is about those early settlers, but not the squatters, a convict. And back in 2005, when that book was published, it was not yet. They were still a bit voiceless. So yes, you're right. I seem to have this preoccupation with wanting to give voice, even if it's not the actual voice, to people who haven't been written about.
You talked about briefly there The Secret River. Writing that book must have changed your life.
Yes, it did. It absolutely did. I mean, first of all, I found my subject. I mean, I'd written half a dozen books before then. But with that book, I found my subject, early Australian history and the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, basically. And using my family stories as a way to kind of shoehorn my way into that, as a lever to open that very difficult story.
And because at the end of Restless, Dolly, Maunder, there's a sort of epilogue, and you write that the lives of Dolly and her forebears all stand on the taking of land, but the family's stories I drew on for this book are silent about that truth. As Dolly's granddaughter, I want to acknowledge that silence and that sorrow. I've told one story here, but standing beside it is another. And so that's, I think you have a new book that's coming out next year that may touch on those other stories, I think.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I can only tell, the stories of my lot. I certainly can't tell any Indigenous stories. That would be wrong and impossible. But I feel as if there is that sense of the stories not told that are not my stories to tell, but they connect with my stories. So the book that's going to come out next year is using the family stories again to try and connect. What I've done is take all the 5 generations of family stories, done a road trip of all the places where they happened, and I've stood on the actual land, thinking about the tiny little snippet of family story, but then putting it in a much bigger context. What else was happening here? Who else was on this land? How was it that my lot got this bit of land? If it's stolen land, exactly how did they steal it? So it's not telling that other story, but it's saying our stories connect, and we have to it's good for us if we can look in the face the fact that they do connect. They are not two separate streams, they are combined.
And so I also wondered how writing Restless, Dolly, Maunder, did it change you? Did it change how you perceived the family, your family? I mean, obviously I suspect it changed how you saw Dolly.
Very much. I mean, I went into it thinking, oh, that cranky old lady. And I came out of it thinking, yes, but boy, she had a lot to be cranky about. And I would have been crankier than that if I'd had to put up with all that. Yes, it's been an interesting book because in some ways it feels like the end of a certain kind of. I thought I'd come to the end of, using my family stories, and certainly in that specific the way of writing about a particular member of the family story, I think I have. But the fact that it's now opened up into this much bigger inquiry, much bigger question, is very exciting. I mean, each book I write, I think, oh, this is the last one. Haven't got anything more in me. But somehow, by the time you get to the end of one, you're thinking, oh, well, there's something just over there that I start every book starts with a question, something I don't understand. And with Restless, Dolly, Maunder, it was, why was my grandmother the way she was? And then with this next one, it's how do we find a place for our feet if we actually recognise that this is stolen land? When I say us, I mean non-Indigenous Australians.
Yeah. Now, well, maybe we should, if anybody's got a question for Kate, maybe now would be a good time for you to ask it. If you would like to put up your hand, if you have a question, there's a questioner over there, and there's a roving mic, so please wait for the mic to get to you. And
Thanks. Hi. I just wondered why you chose third person and not first person for Dolly's story.
Oh, what a good question. Why third person and not first person? Look, I was already being cheeky, selling her story the way I did. It would have been kind of a cheek too far, I think, to have put it in first person. And there's something I like about, most of my books are actually written in the third person, but what do they call it, subjective or something, where the third person is very much the consciousness of one person. It's having it both ways. I can step back from the character when I need to and put in things that she might not have known or thought, but I can also be up close.
yeah, you have a lot of freedom with that third person.
Huge freedom. Yeah.
I just on a sort of vaguely similar thing, I just read a book by an Adelaide writer called Holly Taylor Johnson, and called Little Bit, which is about 3 generations of women. Her mother, and her grandmother. And her grandmother was a drunk, basically, and was appalling to her mother. And she didn't know the grandmother. She writes the 3 stories. She writes the grandmother in the first person.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
How bold.
It's very bold. Very bold. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because when you're writing, you have to try all sorts of things. I think I did a couple of drafts, probably were in first person, and it just doesn't, and then you just try something else. You think, oh, not third person, but, oh, yeah, that's right. You just have, it's trial and error.
Is it?
Oh, thank you, Kate. I remember your writing book when I was studying. It was really helpful. So you've obviously written some non-fiction as well. But I'm interested in Dolly's name, and we probably wouldn't know many girls called Dolly in the 21st century. And was that a common name in that era? Like, what does her first name mean?
Look, I think I remember asking Mum that, and she didn't know, and I don't know either, but I think it was quite a common name. I've read other kind of ye-olde books where one of the girls in the family is called Dolly, whether it's because she was actually the youngest daughter, but because her mother wouldn't have known that she was the last one, so she was always quite a small woman. In fact, there's a possibility that she had celiac disease. I didn't bother to put that in the book. It's kind of not relevant. But she may have been a small, sweet, doll-like baby. It's possible, isn't it? The other thing is that she was the third of her family called Sarah Catherine, and it was necessary for one of them to have a different name.
So Catherine's obviously a
yes, my mother
family
called me
name.
Catherine because of that, and I sometimes regret that I didn't call my daughter. Well, it would have had to be Sarah, and maybe she wouldn't have liked that.
Just quickly, Kate, my nana was Vera May, but she was always known as Dolly.
Oh, well, there you go.
And so she was late 1890s, I think. So I think it may have just been a common nickname.
Yes, yeah.
Another question? No? Is it? Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Kate. I hope you don't mind me asking this, but I'm really curious about Dolly's infidelity and if that was part of the family law or if that is something you wanted to give her.
Dolly's infidelity.
With Jim.
With Jim, yes. Look, it was just hinted at. My mother just hinted at it. Jim Brady was the Catholic boy that my grandmother had fallen in love with and not being allowed to marry because he was Catholic. And Mum used to say, Jim used to visit Dolly when Bert was away. Bert used to go away shearing to get ready money. And Mum said, and I heard a kind of uncomfortableness in Mum's voice every time she got to this bit of the story, and she would say, look, I know Jim Brady definitely visited her. Shouldn't have used the real name. Let's hope there's no relatives of Jim Brady. And she would say, I don't suppose they did anything, or I don't think they did anything. So there was always that doubt in her mind, and therefore in mine. And I thought, look, why not? I mean, he did visit. They had been in love. She had been horribly betrayed by her husband. So, you know, it wouldn't be beyond the pale, would it, for her to have done that?
And when you have Dolly confronting Bert, then he knows about Jim's visits, doesn't he?
That's right. So she thought she had the upper hand in saying, I've found these papers about the child support, and he could come right back. And I know about Jim Brady, so they were kind of locked in this, which was probably the story of their relationship, really, kind of locked in a sort of deadlock, really, with each other.
I mean, you do say that in the book, you do say that they made a good team.
Yeah. I think they did. And, you know, that's not such a bad thing. I mean, plenty of marriages begin in one way and end up in a good team. Possibly there are more important things than, you know, romantic love. But on the other hand, yeah. Bert was actually a really good choice. My grandmother fluked a good husband because unlike a lot of men, then and now, he let her lead, actually. He must have recognised how smart she was and how correct her judgment was about business things. And I think that's because he came from a big family with essentially a single mother. His mother was Mrs. Russell, and she was supposed to be a widow. There was no husband on the scene, but somehow she was always pregnant. And I looked at quite a few of those birth certificates, and many of them say illegitimate. So that means that he grew up in a very, very struggling household. I mean, a woman in those days, there was no child support, no government support of any kind. So he would have grown up watching a woman struggle to just put food on the table for a family of about 8 children. And I think that gave him a sympathy for the bad lot that women had.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much. It's so interesting. One question I have for you, which kind of branches off another. Sometimes when we're looking into family history, we can be searching for something in ourselves. So when you were looking at your grandmother's history and your mother, were there things that crept up that connected to you more than what you suspected and might have been enlightening at the time of you writing and discovering?
Gosh, what a good question. What a good question. And I'm probably not going to answer it as truthfully as you.
Oh, go on.
Look, one thing it did make me think about was being a grandmother. Now, Grandma was a pretty cranky grandma to me because she kind of didn't know any other way to behave, I don't think. But I have given her a little paragraph about what it's like to be a grandmother as opposed to a mother. And that is my own kind of discovery, which I kind of gave to her, which is that when you're a grandmother, it's like they say, all care but no responsibility. It's more than that. It's that you can actually enjoy your grandchildren not as a kind of part of yourself and all your own dreams or disappointments or whatever, disappointments in Dolly's case. You can love them for absolutely just the little humans that they are, that are starting to develop. You have no kind of, there's no kind of agenda. You have no agenda with them. And I, in thinking about Dolly as a grandmother, through the light of my own very happy experience as a grandmother, that was an epiphany that I'm prepared to share.
Was that? Oh, sorry. I thought there was one over there. No? No more questions? No? Well, I'll have to ask another question. When you look back on all the books that you have written, is there one that that retrospectively gives you the most satisfaction, do you think?
Oh, it's like asking a parent to choose between their children. Look, The Secret River will be always close to me because two things about that. First of all, it was where I discovered, what I want to write about. But the other thing is that it was a book I never thought would be published. I didn't write it for publication, as my website says. I had actually given up on the idea of writing. I'd written, half a dozen novels, and they'd all done well. They'd been reviewed well, probably by you, among others. But they didn't sell anything like enough to make even pocket money, really.
Was the idea of perfection the one before?
It was the one before.
Yeah.
But the publisher, don't get me started, when I won that prize, which is the biggest prize, was at that point the richest prize in the world, they had about 6 copies in the warehouse. Even though I had been shortlisted and before that I'd been longlisted, they did have time. So as a result, I did get the prize money, but I made almost nothing out of Australian sales because there weren't any books to be bought. That was heartbreaking. Anyway, that was just kind of the last straw. I thought, all right, I've got to get a proper bit of paper. I've got to spend I'd done a lot of teaching of creative writing, which is why I wrote that book that person up the back referred to. I thought, I'm going to have to spend the rest of my life as a teacher of creative writing rather than as a writer because I need to make proper money. And I love teaching, fortunately. So I enrolled in one of those PhDs that one enrolls in. And I thought, what will I do for my thesis? Because you could write Anyway, I thought I would write a book, sort of biographical history book about my ancestor, the convict, and that would be my thesis. And so that was the reason that book got written. It was really just a means to an end. But the irony is that when it was finished, I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is starting to look like a novel. I'll send it off and see if anybody wants to publish it. And yes, they did. So that told me something quite important about writing sort of for yourself. It was the idea I was interested in that. And that's why I wrote it. Yes, gosh, thinking about the idea of perfection, which I had loved. I mean, that would be my other favourite, I think.
I love that book.
It's very funny.
Loved it.
I laughed all the way through writing that book. So,
And that's still in print, isn't it?
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
Yeah.
They've got copies of it now.
Oh, yes. They do, but it's not Pan Macmillan anymore.
It's it's a lovely book there.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I did mention earlier on that you'd been wanting to write with a view to publication since you were 16.
Yes.
So what happened at 16? What was it?
Well,
why did you suddenly switch on to writing?
look, I'd always been short-sighted, which means I was terrible at any subject where you had to be able to read the board. Nobody knew I was short-sighted. So the only thing I was good at was reading and writing. And I was terrific at composition in primary school. My compositions I used to get up in front of the class and at the teacher's invitation, read them out, and she would then write up on the board the interesting words that I had used. So I got a lot of praise for writing. And it was the only thing I was good at. I was hopeless at everything else. So when I was 16, I wrote a little short story, which I wish I still had a copy. It's probably not bad, actually. At least the subject is not bad. And I sent it off to the only magazine I'd kind of ever heard of, the Woman's Weekly. We didn't get it in my house. Mum didn't believe in those women's magazines, but I sent it off, and I got then these. I've had many rejection slips in my life, but this was physically the smallest. It was on a tiny bit of paper about the size of a cigarette paper. And it said, thank you for your interest, good luck with your writing, but we cannot use your contribution. So that was when I was 16. But it didn't, for some reason it didn't stop me.
Thank goodness for that.
I kept on going. Yes.
Okay, now if there are a couple more questions. One over there, yeah. There. Yeah.
Kate, are you happy with equalization of The Secret River?
Yes, I am so delighted with both the adaptations of The Secret River. There's been do you mean the play or the miniseries, or both? The series, yes. The play is fantastic because it steps right away from the book. I don't know, and it was on in Goulburn not long ago, apparently, The Secret River play. Anyway, they did a brilliant job by reinventing it. But the TV miniseries was terrific. It sticks much more closely to the book, which is, quite hard to do. And the thing that I most respect about it is that they do not flinch from what happens at the end of the book. It's there in the miniseries, and I was very afraid. I had nothing to do with any of these adaptations. I was very afraid that they would fudge it, that they would make it, kind of ambiguous about what happened, that they would make everybody feel good by not having, in fact, a terrible piece of violence at the end. So good on them. I think they did a great job.
There was a question over there, yep.
Hello. Thank you, Kate. I am really enjoying discovering your writing. I think you're wonderful.
Thank you.
I am intrigued at the title you've given for your grandmother's tale, and I just wonder how you came to that title. Because personally, I find that your previous writing, your titles really draw me in, and they resonate with me. Whereas I find Restless Maunder doesn't, for me, as a complete outsider, doesn't quite do her justice, I think. And it didn't draw me in, and I decided to read the book because I wanted to read you.
Right.
Am I allowed to say that?
Absolutely.
It's a bit late now, you've said it.
Yeah, I've said it. Look, you've put your finger on something very important about the book, which is that I think the title... look, I can only say that when you have a book, when you hand it to a publisher, it stops being your book. It's a bit like when you grow apples and you give it to the middleman. They stop being your apples, and that person can sell them any way they like. Covers and titles then become the sort of territory of the publisher. So I had many, many long discussions about the title with the publisher and about not this version of the cover but the paperback, which I don't like. Many discussions. I guess this was the compromise we could come up with. I didn't like having her name on it because I think Dolly gives the wrong idea. It gives the idea of a kind of trivial, ladylike little frocks and frills kind of thing. And restless is a very difficult word to say. So look, I agree. I kind of agree. What do you think it might be called? Have you got a better idea? Putting you on the spot, aren't I?
That did, and that's a very good ploy, I think. If give the solution to a question, or if you point out a problem, you should always have a solution to it. So I was thinking, I thought of that beforehand, and I thought, I don't know, even something like Molly's determination or Molly's path, or something that was more reflective of her. So
yes.
Restlessness for me was just a small part of her character. It was her determination and what she actually did with her life that was quite remarkable.
Yes.
Determined Dolly Maunder.
Absolutely agree. And perhaps not using her name. I mean, I think I had a whole page, I've forgotten them now, I had a page and a half of possible titles. Some of them I think drew on the notion of the hinge. I tried to use that metaphor. Look, I agree. You can only hope that a book survives its title and its cover.
Well, it's very clear that the book has survived its title.
Yes, and look, don't feel bad about being critical about it, and I'm sorry I put you on the spot. I shouldn't have done that.
I think we've reached a point where we should probably draw to a conclusion. Kate will sign copies of Restless or Determined Dolly Maunder. And if you ask us, perhaps you'll cross out the Restless and put in Determined.
Suggest some ideas.
Meanwhile, please thank Kate Grenville.